Shinder from Escarpment Labs. Jonah is the head of the homebrew and food ferments department at Escarpment Labs. He has a BFA in theater production from Ryerson University and an MBA degree from the University of Waterloo, and uses his diverse set of skills to help with product development, marketing, and advocacy at Escarpment. When not working, you can find him walking his dog and making weird ferments. So, welcome, Jonah. I think we're all very excited to see and hear about what you have in store for us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
You want the microphone?
Sure. Yeah.
We'll start with the microphone.
Yeah, we'll leave.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've done this presentation.
We won't use.
Fly catcher. Plug it through the hole. I don't need the microphone. Microphone. Well, it helps with the recording. Oh, yeah. Then I can use it for David.
Uh-oh.
If you don't want to hear the presentation, you can
Yeah,
but I think I think it's the wire. Check. Yeah, check.
Hello.
There we go. Yay!
All right. So,
Can I turn the pump 180 degrees so that the wire bends in the opposite direction?
hello. All right. Take two. Welcome to Jonah's Wild Capture Conversation. This previously was called Good Yeasts and Where to Find Them, but Good Wild Yeast Hunting was my riff. Oh, and I moved the photos, but there's from Good Will Hunting, How Do You Like Them Apples? That's hidden in the background there. Yeah, you can see a sliver of Matt Damon. You know, wild yeast like Matt Damon are elusive and challenging to find. All right, so yeah, we're going to talk about wild yeast a bit, and then we'll do a little Q&A. All right, this is an old photo of the Escarpment. There's now like 30-something of us, but Escarpment Labs, pardon? Like I said, this is an old photo of Escarpment Labs. Anyway, so yes, Escarpment Labs, who are we? Escarpment Labs is Canada's premier liquid yeast supplier, and in general, we've kind of adopted an ethos of make fermentation easy. We've also started getting into food fermentation and kind of offering some of our skill set within the wider fermentation world and not just beer. But in general, liquid yeast is what we do, as well as QC services, custom yeast and bacteria development, and we're making hybrid yeasts. Now we're doing all kinds of crazy things, mostly with yeast. Which is
Are you doing distilling yeast yet or not?
not specifically. Anyway, we'll do a general questionnaire at the end. Yeah, so we're striving for excellence, focusing on quality, and also on, education has really become a core component. If you spend any time on our website, we're kind of, in many ways, giving it all away in a way to just empower homebrewers, brewers, everyone to make better beverages and ferments. Jonah GS, Jonah Greenbaum-Shinder, that's me. Originally, I have a background in theater production. We drank a lot of beer in theater school. It led me to Escarpment Labs one day. I got a master's of business while in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. I am kind of still the head of the homebrew department, although I think we just hired someone to run homebrew instead of me, and I'm basically just doing food fermentation at this point, which is really exciting as well. And for a while, I ran the Wild Yeast Capture program, which I haven't done in a while as well. But I put in the hours for finding wild yeast, and it's a really cool thing to do. As far as food ferments, we're looking a lot at the koji, at tempeh. We sell a kombucha starter. We sell the sourdough. Just kind of exploring that world of ferments as well. Favorite beer styles? I'll say it's on pills. And I'm a home brewer, I have no formal beer training. All right, so yeast, flavor diversity. Why would we care about wild yeast at all? How do we find wild yeast? Where is this wild yeast that we're looking for? If I found something that I think is wild yeast, how do I use it safely without poisoning my friends and family? So at Escarpment Labs, we love to think of yeast as the workhorse of the brewery. If you spent any time on our first website, there was 5 or 6 yeasts that were described as workhouse strains, and then we diversified our language to use other words besides workhorse. But no, yeast is, brewers make wort and yeast makes beer. Beer has existed longer than we've understood yeast, and primarily was kind of wild and fermented or passed down through iterations of house culture. As craft has gotten more exciting, we've gotten more into experms, into breaking glasses, into bread, and just the kind of the weird and the wonderful. And that's also seen people get more excited about using kind of terroir within beer. So why would I want to use wild yeast? So this is just a lovely image of like the beer genetic diversity wheel. The names are kind of beer 1 and beer 2 is not exactly exciting, but pretty much all of the yeasts that you would be brewing with in the world exist or can be mapped out to this family tree, including wild yeast in some capacity. Wild yeast is often going to come with some of the funkier flavors, as opposed to like a Cali Ale or even something maybe more in the Belgian world. But and these images are cute and great. So barnyard, one looks like bacon. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to be.
Really make a bacon beer.
You could make a bacon beer. You could make a bacon beer with wild yeast, but you couldn't find wild yeast on bacon. I bet. I bet you the fat would.
You just
There's the door, sir. But you get these kinds of weirder, wilder barnyard, pineapple, pop, spice, banana flavors that you're not going to get from a clean ale strain from wild yeast. Often you're going to get higher attenuation and lower flocculation, kind of again with the saison being seasonal farmhouse brewing originally were wild yeasts that were found and domesticated. So peppery, fruity aromas, often with a more medium fermentation rate, as opposed to something English ale that's going to be drop clean and be fruity and ferment reasonably fast, and then you have your British mild or whatever. So yeast in general, yeast is ubiquitous. Yeast is all around us. We're breathing it in. We're wiping it on our clothes. It's on our bodies. We're covered in microbes. We all contain multitudes. So it's especially dominant in sugar sources, fruit, wine, and fruit, but also like bees, honey. People will capture off of anything fruity, let's say, anything that has a sugar source is more reliable, and also kind of we pick up cool things, hops often. You can pull wild yeast off of, which is cool just that there's a symbiosis there. But then of course, it's not just yeast that are ubiquitous. Molds, bacteria are all around us as well. So how do we create an environment that's going to capture, specifically we're looking in beer, we usually use Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Is kind of the beer yeast, or the bread yeast, but the beer yeast for us. So how do we create an environment that's going to allow us to more confidently, and not within a lab necessarily, because not everyone has access to lab tools to know and isolate and run PCR to know exactly the species, but that we've found what we're looking for. So something we do at work for the beginning of our wild capture process is creating an environment that is hostile to microbes that are not yeast. So often we'll take hopped wort because we're not looking for lactose, let's say, we're just looking for Sac. So hop resistant, ethanol tolerant, and osmotolerant. So we're going to take hopped wort, we're going to keep it decently low gravity so that there's some sugar but not too much sugar, because that can overwhelm yeasts, especially at low counts when we're talking about yeast flying through the air. And we're going to add about 3%, ideally with ethanol if you can access it, which you can probably access in some capacity. I'm not exactly sure where you would get ethanol, but somewhere. Or like vodka would work. Something clean and boozy. There are calculators if you need to figure out how to get to 3%. I'm not going to show you, but you can Google that to figure out, small amounts of hop wort and 40% vodka or whatever to get your 3% solution. And whoa, too far. So from there, you could take a strawberry, you could take a bean, you could take. And then, yeah, so you vessels to do this project in, or, any sterile flask will do to make it starters. You can use that as your wild capture bottle as well. And then, yeah, sources, apples, grapes, berries, lots of stuff we found on tree bark, not just sap, but all kinds of Angiosphora and Tortospora and weird, wild yeasts exist in wood. Wasps, hops, elderberry, all these things that are just kind of out of the environment that are close or in and around church sources. Yeah, so if, really, with beer, with ferments in general, like, you've seen some signs of fermentation. We've created an environment that is not conducive for bad microbes. Does it smell good? Like any beer, if it smells good and it's fermented, it's generally safe to use. If it doesn't smell good, then pitch it and start over. Not pitch it, punch your beer, throw it away, and start over. And a step up, I would say, would be a safe bet as well. Just to, before you throw it in 5 gallons or make a starter, you can take that small bottle and add it to a 1 liter ferment and kind of see where you're at. Test FG, don't consume if it's under 2% ethanol, and if it's above 4.5 pH, because that's important for not getting, what's the name of that canning nightmarish? Botulism, there it is. And in general, 4.5 is kind of the safe for eating and consuming pH level. Here's one of our founders sampling what would later become wild thing off of that's an apple, but I think it was a strawberry. There's some little containers with samples in it and airlocks, and then there's plated yeast from those samples. When you get really fancy, and PCR isn't something that I totally understand, but once you've isolated your strains and you're going down the road of isolation fully, and not just kind of capturing, so you've plated your samples, let's say you plate a sample and there's 5 things on it, and you isolate it down to colonies that have morphology that is similar to yeast, which is generally a circle that has a nice round on it and not misshapen. Yeast is almost always a gentle circle. You would run it through PCR, and that would allow you to identify that it was in fact Saccharomyces or not. And that's kind of what these bands are indicating or not. The one being the latter to show where your various options are, and then where the lines fall on 2 through 8, and A through H. Well, A is a ladder again, so B through H shows you what you're dealing with. And then the sequencing of those samples, once they run through PCR, we send to a lab, in our case, at U of G, and you can see these are all found in natural fermentation for the most part, from the Chancias, which you may recognize from the lactic magic strain, to Saccharomyces cerevisiae, Saccharomyces paradoxus, Gluconobacter, Charlostoria delbrueckii, things that are found in natural lines, things that are found in natural ferments, some things that are found in soy ferments. But there is, well, on this list, there's one Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So in general, it's a bit of a wild game. You're casting a wide net here, but if you continue to put it through the paces, you will dial into things that only kind of survive in beer. We're still in the wild world, and you're not really doing this if you're looking for a clean beverage anyways. Once you've isolated it down, there are even some sac strains that are lousy with maltose, so you want to be able to put it through again through further paces. Can it get up to 5% ethanol? Can it make a 5% beer? Will it consume maltose? That's important. Often when we're testing for the tests that I've run, I'm starting with 25 to 35 samples, and I'll drill it down to 5 or 10 samples that are looking promising, and then scrape them out and go from there. Often our goal is to find Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but alternative microbes exist and can add exciting flavors to ferments as well. Welly has used some of our strains. Wild Thing is a strain of ours that we've sold. That's a fun wild strain that was captured by staff. Farmhouse strain that we never saw anymore. Alright, so thinking about these characteristics, the range from low to high to esters. Often you'll get that acetate banana flat vibe, and often phenols traditionally in Belgian beers. Attenuation, if it is maltose fermenting, it can range anywhere from 50 to often you'll see stuff that's like will go super dry to close to 100% attenuation. It is possible, I found a few, but it is rare to find something that's kind of closer to a normal ale strain. They do exist, that's kind of how we ended up with normal ale strains in the first place, but they are few and far between. And often they are slower to ferment because they haven't been domesticated. And then we end up with oddballs. Some of our mixed cultures, Richard's Zippy culture, I know has Pichia and Canospora in it. And I think we might actually release that to Brews because it's a really cool strain. And I think people would like it. And Slate brewed a beer with it, and it was really good. The squash bug. That's another strain that we found. We did a wild capture at U of G and Royal City in Guelph, brewed a beer with it. And a similar strain that isn't the squash flower strain was also brewed by Fixed Beer in Guelph. That was maybe the squash flower was near a butterfly. And so there was a butterfly beer that was brewed. Oh, this is recorded too. Anyways, here's just 2 examples of strains that were captured off of. One was okra and one was a squash flower. You can see the various pH finishes and degrees of attenuation finishes. There's a variance there. The okra was more citrus, pineapple, whereas the squash flower was more subtle green apple. And it isn't to do with necessarily that it was on okra or was on squash flower, it's just kind of the chaos of the world that is aligned in this. It's not that every time you isolate off of okra, it's going to be citrus and pineapple. It's just that was the situation for that moment in time, and that kind of terroir. So you can see often these strains ferment better, better hotter in a kind of more naturalistic environment. Here's a comparison of Wild Thing at 65 versus 75 Fahrenheit, and it ferments faster and lower in 14 days at 75, because that's a little less controlled, a little bit more environmental. And you can see on the right, left, over here, you can see as well the comparison of flavor, which actually, interestingly enough, seems to be a little bit more expressive, but also a bit more body and linger, so that's kind of what we're really getting there. But also more fruit and citrusy on the cooler side, which you wouldn't think would happen, but wild yeast, they're full of surprises. Wild strawberry yeast, less remarkable, but still interesting. Saison, earthy, did ferment faster, hotter, which also makes sense. There it is, Ontario Farmhouse Ale Blend. I knew we'd get to that. So yeah, Royal Series used our wild yeast. Sawdust has used our wild yeast. I don't know we talk about it anymore, but they did use our wild yeast. Rebel has used our wild yeast, and in general is like a super natural, low intervention situation with their wine, with their cider. They're doing a lot of really cool things at Rebel. Cool that they spoke to you probably about some of those things. Welly and Younghurst have also used those yeasts as well, or similar wild yeasts. And lots of homebrewers are digging the wild yeast, which is cool. It's a little bit easier to go in on 5 gallons than on 500 or 5,000 gallons. Yeah. Milk the Funk is a really good resource if you're kind of getting into the funkier side of things. There's some good sections on wild yeast, on Brett Blackjaw, on PBO, and on other ways to capture. Does anyone have any questions? This guy does.
Yeah, so you mentioned with the anaerobic fermentation, this part with the carbon dioxide, how picky should I be?
What do you mean picky?
So, am I striving for absolute oxygen exclusion, or is it just like, yeah, 90%?
No, you want to get it all out there. So purge your keg. You don't want to like pound it with CO2. Like purge is fine. You don't want to put like 10, 20, 30 psi on it, because that will
Carbonate it.
well, it'll just make it. I mean, you're not doing this at that point. I guess you could do it with a bottle in a keg. That's an interesting idea. Normally, I've been doing it on a plate,
Yeah.
so that I'm trying to keep mold at bay, and then I can pull a sample and restreak it.
It's sort of a beat for road, but you're playing wild yeast.
Yeah.
The same.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But yeah, you don't want to. You can purge it for 10 seconds, and then like after you put the plate in.
So, thorough enough.
Thorough.
When you're looking for like a piece of fruit or something to like look at for like where you're going to capture the wild things. I've heard like people like look at say a blackberry, they look at it where it's kind of like starting to go bad, but not quite going bad. Is there like something visually you would look for with a piece of fruit that you would kind of target?
I think you get a little more chaotic at that point, but also like that a lot of early cider was just fermented from apples that had fallen and started to rot and ferment. So I think that there's something that's already started to eat away at it at that point. So that very well could be yeast. And I pulled apples off of our apple tree in our backyard that had nothing on it, but that did not look like that. So I don't think that's a bad place to start. But with this type of work in general, like, you get a lot of shit before you get the gold.
So you would look at it and see like maybe it's starting to deteriorate, but it's not the point where it's like too far gone.
Yeah, like if it has visual mold on it, I would probably go for it.
Yeah.
But also, that doesn't mean there's not yeast also hanging out and feasting, so.
For your panels, how do you determine the pieces with the flavors? What does your panel structure look like?
That's pre-pandemic. We ran like a 10-person sensory and had a large questionnaire that I'm sure we could make accessible to you. That allowed for us to like come up with those wheels, and it was I think 1 through 5 for pretty much all of the good and bad flavors. And for wild stuff, we would use a funkier template than if you were doing lagers or something like that. And that's how that information is generated. But we can make that available if you send me an email. I can send that your way.
Without access to a lab or streaking, if we have a sample that we're trying to grow up and it forms mold, is there anything we can do to isolate the mold out of it and get back to pure sack? Or are we out of luck?
That's a good question. I mean, like skimming, like what you would do in for hot sauce or something like that. If it's white, if it's green, yeah, you're probably fine. If it's red or blue, like it's not gonna happen. Yeah, if it's red or blue, it's not good.
Better blue, better not blue.
Yeah. But I wouldn't say that it's a total goner situation, especially if you're like throwing it back into an ethanol hopped situation.
So maybe upping the ethanol in the solution in the medium.
Yeah, trying to skim what you can, and like, I mean, like for even with plates, like we'll pull stuff off of plates that have mold and restreak it, and it will be fine. So if you can get to it, maybe it's a 2-step situation. So you pull off your mold, you put it back into a 3% solution, you stir it for a day, or don't stir it and leave it for a week. Watch it carefully, and then step it up one more time before the molds come in, just to make sure you've got a good culture and colony size.
So they kind of like pre-acidified, pre-alcohol, and therefore it should keep the mold at bay to be able to compete.
Yeah, I guess pH down is also something that could be an option for you, because these things should, they're not going to be as happy, but mold will be even less happy at a slightly lower pH. Any other questions?
When you purchase a wild strain, is it a pure one strain of sap, or is it often?
Like from us?
Yeah.
Our wild thing is one strain of sap, yeah. Unless we're telling you it's a mixed culture, it's a pure culture.
Let me get to like painstakingly picking out.
Well, at some point it was painstakingly picked out, yeah, but like when we're cropping yeast, it's pulled from a frozen down sample and then plated, and we know from morphology and photos that this is what we're looking for. If a plate had 10 different colonies, we're not going to use it. So it's a pretty robust QC. And actually, I think they run PCR on every harvest at this point. So not only is it just like our eyes on a plate, it's scientifically validated. Yeah. And I did bring a half naturally fermented wine, if anyone would like to try that. A pitch style Libre on afterwards, but fermented from 1060 to 1030 before I got to it. So kind of wild yeasty. We'll be hanging out for a bit if anyone has any other questions. I also brought some yeast and some koji, which will be my next talk for GTA Brews, if anyone wants to buy Escarpment products. Thanks for having me.